how do you even frame this issue? I think there's been a lot of discussion about it, which makes it seem like an issue of charity and not as an issue of justice or law.
Right. So you mean the migrants, the asylum seekers at the Texas border? Yes. Because everything with Haiti, for me, the crisis is a crisis of imperialism. And so the way to frame this issue is to say Haitians would not be at the Texas-Mexico border if the U.S. was not in Haiti destroying the Haitian state and causing all kinds of misery there. And so that's the first way to frame it. The second way to frame it is to think about, I think a lot of people think that these people just showed up from Haiti, 15,000 of them, maybe did they swim across from the island into Texas? And that's that. And I'm just wondering why people are not even asking why there's so many people at that border. And we have to step back and try to figure out, why are there so many people at that border? Why isn't anyone, and to do that is also I have to ask, why isn't anyone talking about the border in Tijuana that has thousands and thousands of people waiting? And this all has to do with U.S. policy. U.S. policy against migrants in particular, and especially the past 5 years, there are always migrants coming from Central and South America, result of U.S. imperialism in these places. If we think about Honduras and all these places that suffer coups d'etats and right-wing takeovers, right? So we've always had that. But in around 2016, you started having Haitians coming in, coming through Brazil up the 7 countries into the country. It's around the same time that you had this process called metering. That started under the Obama administration, where to ask for asylum, the process to ask for asylum just completely slowed down to a halt. And I don't know if you've heard, maybe I don't know if your listeners have heard of metering, but basically, in order to even come up to the border to ask for asylum, you would be given a number and an appointment to come and ask for asylum. So it's not like you come up to the border. So then, and they would only limit the numbers of people coming, right, to ask for asylum. So they said, well, today we'll just accept 50 asylum claims. And everyone else would just have to sit there and wait for weeks and months. So this is when you start getting the numbers growing. And then, with Trump 2 years ago, installed the Remain in Mexico, right? So you have both metering. So you have thousands of people waiting already. And a lot of people, even brown people of color who are not Black, are not from Mexico. So they're all, left there, living in squalor in Mexico. So the numbers just swelled, in addition to the caravans that started coming together for safety reasons, because, it's not safe to travel alone and, going through these areas. So this is the reason. This is like with the complicity of the Mexican and other governments, the U.S. border actually has moved. There's 20,000, Black migrants in the southern Mexican border. The Mexican government has been harassing them as well. 2 years ago, the African migrants rose up and protested. So this to me, and I am Haitian-American, but this to me, to talk only about Haitians is to exceptionalize Haitians and to not link their experiences to those other people who are suffering from U.S. imperialism, including other Black immigrants from Nicaragua, Venezuela, Colombia, as well as from the African continent.
How do you compare the treatment of asylum seekers by Trump versus Biden? Because of course Biden's shtick, part of his big shtick was that he was not a Trump, right? He had a heart. How different are their policies? Is it just discourse?
It's always discourse. I mean, we should have learned this with Obama, right? I mean, the reality is you say one thing and then you do another. You should always follow, which is why Glenn Ford, rest in peace, Glenn Ford, yeah. But used to call them the more effective evil, right? Because they Trump was too crass, right? And Trump said all the quiet parts out loud.
Right. Like he just called them a shithole country.
Right.
Biden is just nicer, but he would never say that.
He would never say that. But at the same time, so Biden kept a lot of the, Trump's policies, including, and this is important, the Title 42, which uses COVID as an excuse not to even allow people to come up and ask for asylum. And it also required the CDC to change Haiti's status in terms of COVID to high, so that they say, well, these people are coming from a place where COVID is high. And we know, using disease to keep Black people out is a very long history of racism and white supremacy. When the CDC, for example, labeled Haitians as AIDS and HIV carriers back in the 90s. So this is like close to my heart. I remember that time. So Biden's been using that Title 42. And I don't know if you know this, but there's a report that came out of CNBC that Biden has, under Title 42, between January and now, there's been 690,000 people deported under Biden. Right. That's more than Trump under Title 42. And Biden's only been in office for 9 months. And Obama was the deporter in chief, and he only deported 3 million people in 8 years. We are at almost 1 million before the year's over. So that tells us that, no matter which party is in power, the policies are very similar in terms of migration, and they might sound nicer, but the policies are similar. And then the policies that create migrants, right? U.S. imperialism in Haiti in particular, are very much similar, are the same policies. They just carry on from one to the other.
Kind of basic, but what do we even mean by imperialism, and what are the policies in today's world? Like what is the legacy of imperialism, but also how does it manifest today?
Well, the legacy of imperialism is, if you read Lenin, it's like imperialism. And this for me went, because my specialty actually is also the African continent. So imperialism is when the Europeans met in Berlin and cut up, they decided to cut up the African continent and pacify the living people and took over the land. And you basically take over the land and processes, you run the place. And imperialism in the US is basically, U.S. imperialism is the same thing. You take control of the political machinery and the economic machinery of these places where their sovereignty is no longer available to them. So Haiti is a perfect example. And I've been, I say this all the time. Look, Haiti has, the Haitian state has been destroyed. Haiti does not have sovereignty. And the latest example is such that, for example, after the assassination of Jovenel Moïse, whose mandate had run out in February 2021, millions of people in Haiti protesting that he gets out. What happens? The core group, which we can talk about, the core group and the State Department and the Organization of American States said, well, we support Moïse's mandate. He gets to stay in power 1 more year. So despite what civil society says, the Haitian, the US spoke, and then they supported him. So despite all of this, it's the same. So then he appoints Ariel Henry, who is not an elected official. He appoints him, and then he gets assassinated on the day that Ariel Henry was supposed to be sworn in as prime minister. So the reality is this: the other acting interim prime minister, Claude Joseph, should have been the prime minister that kept on because Henry wasn't put in. What does Biden do? He sends a group of people to Haiti that weekend, and then they've decided that Henry is their man. And then they announce immediately that Henry would be the prime minister, leading Haiti to democratic elections. Now, before Moïse was assassinated, the U.S. was pushing for elections, and the Haitian community, I call them bourgeois opposition, were saying we can't have elections until we don't have an elected government. We can't have elections under these circumstances. The U.S. is pushing for elections. As soon as they pick Henry, now they're saying, oh, we don't need to have elections. We can wait to the end. So what that tells me is, if you're not a colony, how is it that the core group can decide that who's going to be your prime minister, that you don't need a president right now, we can hold off on elections? And this is why I blame the US media as well, because US imperialism in Haiti has been the complete takeover of the Haitian state. Of course, with the complicity of the neo-colonial minions on the ground, right? And our non-Black light-skinned oligarchy, which run, everything in Haiti as well. So they work together with the oligarchy, and they've taken over sovereignty. But they're the ones that also, put in place Hillary Clinton, placed Michel Martelly in that political party in power in 2011. So we're suffering from 10 years of installed leaders for Haiti. That is a classic imperialism. There is no sovereignty for Haitians. So that's what I mean by that.